Hi, this is a video to talk about Pali, my own experience learning the ancient language that's the most important language for the history of Buddhism, called Pali. It's especially important for Theravada Buddhism. It's important for anyone who's interested in Buddhist philosophy. It's a language that has important links to many living languages in India, in Sri Lanka, in Southeast Asia, Burmese, Thai, Cambodian, etc. This is a video that obviously people have requested that I made for some time. Why am I finally making it today? Well, funny story. 30 minutes ago, my final exam for Japanese ended. End of my level 1 Japanese university course. I'm completely exhausted. I woke up at about 6 a.m. this morning. I wrote a 2.5-hour exam. The reason why I've got a beard is because I'm exhausted. I've been studying a lot, burning the candle at both ends. That's the first part of the answer to the question. How do you learn Pali? Like any other language, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of hard work. But the truth is, if I don't make a video when I'm exhausted, I won't make a video at all. Because if I were well rested, I would be getting work done. So in most of my videos, I look exhausted, and in most of my new videos in the future, I'm going to continue to look exhausted, because that's when I set aside the time to try to make a video and share some of my thoughts and memories with you all. My patron saint behind me, in case you don't recognize him, that's Edward Snowden, looking down over me. So you might have been expecting a Buddha statue in the background, but no, I don't have that kind of stuff in my apartment. In terms of what gets covered in this video, number one, I'm going to talk about some of my positive experiences with learning Pali as a language, with being a Pali scholar, because that's something I was, in as much as anyone can exist as a Pali scholar for years and years. And I do have some positive experiences to share. And just lately in some email correspondence, I was made aware of the fact that almost all of my writing online consists of warnings for people learning Pali. Not necessarily negative, but trying to warn you of dangers and difficulties you're going to encounter. And a lot of my writing about my own life gives a lot of emphasis to the sense of frustration, failure, disaffection, insuperable obstacles that I encountered and that I expect others will encounter in that field. So in this video, to start with, I'm actually going to say some positive stuff about my experience. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the central question of the work itself. How do you learn Pali? How do you teach yourself Pali? And it's mostly going to be about teaching yourself Pali, because there are very few places in the world where someone else can teach to you. You're expected to be an autodidact absolutely everywhere, including Europe, Asia, etc. And then part 3, I'm going to give some thoughts about why I quit, why I'm no longer a Pali scholar today. So this is going to be one long video. And it'll be very interesting to a small number of people, admittedly. If you're seriously interested in Buddhism, if you're seriously interested in why so few people are really competent in Pali, why there's so little new original research coming out, this is a good video to watch. And if you're considering this as an option for yourself, of course, it's a video to watch also. A small number of people who know me personally may also find it interesting, or they may not. All right. The positive side of my experience with studying Pali, which I never talk about. I never want to sound like I'm boasting. And one of the reciprocal aspects of that is that there are people on the internet, and in real life too, face to face, there are people who denounce me by claiming that I was never given access to institutions that I was given access to, by claiming that people never worked with me or never could work with me who did work with me. A lot of people, especially before this YouTube channel started, a lot of people would basically invent an imaginary character of who they thought I was. And, they'd then attack that character or invent reasons in their own mind for what they thought were my failures or my obstacles, or why I couldn't accomplish various things. And very often what they were attacking me for failing to accomplish were things I never wanted to accomplish at all. And that's, of course, partly because my own approach to the history, it's very sincere, but it is very realistic. I am not someone who ever owned magical crystals. I've never owned amethysts. I've never done yoga. I don't smoke marijuana. I am not a stereotypical hippie involved in Buddhism in any way. I'm not interested in glorifying the past. I have a real sincere interest in a lot of important historical issues like slavery and colonialism and the opium trade. And I'm sincerely interested in the ancient history of Buddhism. I'm sincerely interested in the modern, contemporary, ongoing history of Buddhism. But I'm interested in real things. I want to deal with reality all the time. And that does alienate me from most people in the field. And that's why, both on the internet and in real life, a lot of those people say bad things about me. I hope you can tell, even from my tone of voice, I really don't resent it. And as I'm about to say, and talking about the positive side of it, that also didn't create a problem for me in the field. Because the types of events and institutions and opportunities that those people would block me from are opportunities I don't want. They're things I don't want to be a part of. So, I don't feel any sense of loss that I wasn't invited to events that I would have refused to attend, or I would have just, quietly avoided ever attending. And the other side of that is these people who kind of put in the effort and energy to hate me. And I just know hate is different from fear. There are people who fear me, and there are people who hate me. They're two different things. Those people are really unaware that, all over the world, I had the red carpet rolled out for me simply because I was a legit Pali scholar. What does it mean to be a legit Pali scholar? Some people judge me on the basis of my handwriting. I worked very hard on this language, and it is not a spoken language, not a living language you can really have a conversation in. I had beautiful penmanship, and I don't mean writing Pali in Romanized letters. I don't mean using the same alphabet we use for English. I could read and write Pali in the Burmese tradition, in the Sinhalese tradition, i.e. the tradition from Sri Lanka, Thai, Lao, Cambodian, and I also worked on some of the minority scripts because I was interested in the orthography. So look, okay, branching off from the word orthography, what were the positive things I had happened to me just by being a legit Pali scholar, just by teaching myself the language, working very hard, putting up a website, developing good handwriting, developing a deep knowledge of the history, the literature. Again, I'm reading contemporary studies, I'm reading ancient materials, I'm reading all kinds of stuff. What doors did open for me? The stuff I cared about. Again, it's not some meditation retreat at a hippie institution where people hate me. Those were not the opportunities I was looking for. What was rewarding for me and the doors that are open for me was I got to see stone inscriptions in person. I got to see palm leaf manuscripts. I got to visit archives. And I don't just mean academic archives. So that was also very rewarding for me. All over the world, in Asia, in Europe, I've seen important historical materials in academic archives. I've seen archives inside Buddhist monasteries. I've seen archives inside museums and so on too. I've had access to wonderful, inspiring historical materials, hands-on. That mattered to me. Those were the doors that were open for me. Those are people who respected me. And some of them are individual scholars who knew me for years and who respected my work. Again, however you want to characterize my work, people who were experts and devoted their lives to this stuff met me, got to know me at conferences, sometimes at archives. Some of the most important people I met. So I was spending all this time in archives. I met those people at the archives. Some of them, stayed in touch with my email for years and years. Others were people who met me for 5 minutes once. Show up at a Buddhist monastery. And these are not just average Buddhist monasteries. A Buddhist monastery where I knew there was some kind of scholarly or historical tradition that was important that I wanted to connect with. And, the monks looked at my handwriting, they looked at my work, they asked about my background, you have some kind of conversation about Buddhism, and then they say, okay, and they unlock the door to whatever it is. I was treated wonderfully at such a long list of institutions. And, again, I don't get offended when people denounce me this way on the internet. People say, nobody in Western academia could ever work with this guy. And again, this is sort of before YouTube, so people imagine that I was this very scary character. I'd never heard my voice. And I guess they find the textbooks I made, or the practicals I guess they find that scary. I don't know. Most of it's pretty boring. Yeah, my work on Pali grammar, pretty terrifying. I had an offer to do a PhD. I've had offers, plural, to do PhDs in England, in Germany, in the United States, famous universities like Stanford in the United States, the most famous universities in England. One of the things you can get out of Google. I did deliver this one lecture at Oxford University, UK. If I'd stayed longer at Cambridge, I would have delivered a lecture at Cambridge. I had to leave. I went to Cambodia, so I didn't stay long enough for that to happen. Delivered a lecture at SOAS in London. When I first got involved in Pali, when I first decided that it was really Pali was the language I was going to study, not Sanskrit, not something else, not Mongolian, I made a list of who were the major figures in the field who were still alive that I'd like to meet, that I'd like to contact, communicate with. And much more quickly than I ever thought would have been possible, I met all of those people. Like, really, when I was still a beginner, I remember when the last person came off my list, and I had to stop and reflect, wow, now every single person on my list, I've either spoken to in person or I've had significant email correspondence with over a long time. And there were people who were not on that list who I did meet and who I benefited from meeting. The positive part of my experience is, and this is what I'm trying to share with you, whoever's viewing this, if you are willing to do the work to become some kind of legit Pali scholar, you have something to show your legitimacy, which again can be great handwriting. It can be that you've done surveys of manuscript material. You just got back from looking at stone inscriptions. You've done something that shows your legitimacy, your sincerity, your hard work, your dedication, your ability, your talent, your intelligence. If you can show that, and you're not an eccentric, you're not insane, you're not corrupt, you're not a cult leader, because many people in this field are some of those things. If you've got that, my experience is many, many institutions rolled out the red carpet for me and treated me extremely well. And I mean everywhere. In Canada, in Taiwan, in Thailand. Some of these being elite, closed Buddhist monastic institutions. I was only in Bangkok for a couple of days. And on the basis of my reputation, as it was way back then, so like back when I just had one small site talking about how to teach yourself Pali on the internet, on the basis of that website and maybe one or two casual articles, I got an invitation to go and meet the most senior scholarly monks at the Marble Temple in Bangkok. The Marble Temple, whatever you want. That is an elite institution, and I'm not going to say it's hard for anyone to go there. I think anyone, if you just want to see the architecture, you can arrange to have a tour. But to get the invitation I got at that institution is not easy. And it was easy for me, just for those reasons. When I was in Sri Lanka, I thank the people involved profusely. When I was in Sri Lanka, I stayed in the same Buddhist monastery that used to be the home of Bhikkhu Bodhi. When I was in the United States, I met Bhikkhu Bodhi. I talked to him for many hours. It was about a week. I forget if it was 5 days or what. It was like a 7-day retreat thing. I talked to Bhikkhu Bodhi about his life, about studying Pali, about Buddhism, about all these things. So, Bhikkhu Bodhi is as famous as anyone gets in this field. All these institutions. In that sense, I had a wonderful experience. And I went into this as someone whose only university degree is in political science. I don't have a university degree in Buddhism. And as mentioned, it's one of the things that makes me very different from other people in the field. I remember I read someone's PhD thesis about southern Laos. Laos is already a small enough country, but it had a long period of time where it was split into 3 kingdoms. And this was a PhD thesis about the southernmost kingdom. And this PhD thesis referred to it as a magical kingdom, as a wonderful place, as this sort of paradise on earth. This, when I look at the history of that same kingdom, I see slavery, I see the opium trade, I see the elephant trade. There were rice fields, but really the main cash economy has to do with capturing slaves and capturing elephants. doesn't mean I'm anti-Lao. On the contrary, I devoted years of my life to studying the history and politics of Laos, ancient as well as modern, as well as medieval, as well as colonial era. I was very interested in all of it. But whether I'm looking at Buddhism in its strictest definition, or I'm looking at a Buddhist society, I don't have those rose-colored glasses on. I'm looking at what's really there. Slavery and all, wars and all, hypocrisies and all, hell and the devil and all. I mentioned some other videos. One of the biggest kind of mind games that gets played by Western Buddhists is pretending that hell isn't in the Pali Canon. So I've had, in many ways, an enormously positive reaction. I've had a lot of rewards for the work I put into studying Pali, teaching myself Pali. Now, to give one example of that, Richard Gombrich, who is still alive, he is retired. Richard Gombrich is absolutely one of the most famous and powerful and influential people in the Western study of Theravada Buddhism. He was not on my list for people I was really trying to meet. Just honestly, I liked his first book. I had mixed feelings about his later books. I'm a critic of some of his work. I'm appreciative of some of his work in him. But he was giving a lecture in Bangkok, and I went to this lecture. And, again, I'm trying to only tell you the positive side here. There are a lot of negative things I could say. But this lecture in Bangkok, it demonstrated the whole conference demonstrated many of the things that are fundamentally wrong with the study of Theravada Buddhism in the 21st century. But Richard Gombrich was there, and he gave an excellent lecture. And when the other speakers were giving their lectures, Gombrich was sitting to one side. He was on stage, but not at the podium. And I remember, I won't name who this is, but a senior professor, the PhD who teaches in Europe, was giving a lecture talking about Pali manuscripts, so palm leaf manuscripts. And I did not say anything to challenge her. I did not say anything to disagree with her. But when question period came, I asked a question, and from the framing of the question, from the phrasing and presentation of the question, it was just obvious that I actually knew this material. And I hate to say it, but it was pretty obvious that she did not. And although she had read a well-prepared script that's ultimately just summarizing other people's research, she responded to my question by having a very shrill voice, freaking out on stage, and saying immediately, she didn't know who I was. She said, "Well, obviously, you know much more about this subject than I do, so perhaps you can answer your own question." This is supposed to be an academic conference, And of course, so she's scowling and very negative, and she never said a word to me again in my life, neither by email nor face to face. I was, at that conference, and I had not said anything to disagree with her or challenge her. But the one person there, of course, really responded positively. Richard Gombrich brightens up and looks at me and thinks, and you could see him ask the person, "Who's this guy? This guy knows what he's talking about." So that's the positive aspect of it. A lot of people hate and fear Richard Gombrich. And again, hatred and fear are two different things. And I think they hate him for all the wrong reasons. Maybe they fear him for the right reasons. Because if you're a fraud, Richard Gombrich can expose you as a fraud. And in a sense, on a really low-key way, that was what had just happened to me at that conference. But Richard Gombrich saw me there. He immediately recognized that I was not just a talent, but someone who really had hands-on experience, who had done the hard work, studying the language, studying the materials, being on the field. He invited me to dinner that night. We spoke continuously in that one night. The conference ended relatively early. Academic conferences don't run till late hours of the night. So we talked for hours right then, the minute the conference ended. And then he went to his hotel room briefly to freshen up. Then we went to dinner. We talked for hours that night. Later, I met up with him in England. He invited me to give this lecture. He said very flattering things. Now, ironically, okay, I'm only supposed to talk about the positive things here. Ironically, there was a period of time when people in Buddhist studies hated me and said bad things about me because I was friends with Richard Gombrich. So because this professor likes me, other people hate me because they think, oh, now he's on Gombrich's side. Those two are together. And I mean, at that very conference, just when I was first chatting with Gombrich, saying, "Oh yeah, I live in Laos. This is the kind of research I've been doing. This is the type of work I've done over the last couple of years." Just standing there in the hallway, the other professors who were there, the other professors and graduate students, a couple of PhD students, stood in a group apart from me and Gombrich in silence, in invidious silence, fuming. It didn't say a word to us. And Gombrich, of course, he's a very self-confident guy. I remember, he turned to them and with a somewhat beatific and yet challenging smile, sort of smiled at them like, "Are any of you even going to try to talk to me?" He was quite right to do. He was right to give them the opportunity to come over and talk to him. He's the leading figure in this field, in the field that the conference was about. At that conference, he's the most senior, most experienced, most knowledgeable person. Nobody wants to talk to him except me, because nobody has the guts. And look, why do I have the guts? Why did I have the guts to talk to these people? Because unlike most people who come out of the British academic system, I was honest with everybody. One digression leads to another, but I'm giving you here a lot of the positive, rewarding aspects of what studying Pali is like, what it's all about. Don't lie to anyone about your ability, about your accomplishment, about your background. If you're an autodidact, if you taught yourself, be honest about that. Whatever it is, be upfront. Because the British in general are not. And that's what you're distinguishing yourself from. Whether or not you have a PhD, whatever your academic background is. But I remember I once spoke to a very passionate Sri Lankan guy who knew a lot about Buddhism and cared a lot about Buddhism. We had this conversation and about the history of Pali as a language, about the state of the literature, and he found me to be extremely well informed and learned. He was very interested in what I had to say. And he said, "Tell me, what textbook are you using to teach yourself Pali?" Now, because I was really on the grind all the time, I was working hard. I would study when I was on the bus. I was passionate about this language and this area of studies. I had it in a pocket in my jacket. Oh no, here's the textbook. I could show it to him. And this guy, he's Sri Lankan. He's not a Pali scholar, but he's a knowledgeable guy. He rapidly sort of leads through this, and he says, "This is much too basic. This is much too introductory. Based on this conversation, you must be far more advanced than this by now." And my reply, in that moment, with no pause, no hesitation, I looked him in the eye and said, "No, actually, I'm on page 25 of that textbook. But I know the first 24 pages exceedingly well." Don't be a fraud. Be real with people. If you're passionate about something and you're a beginner, tell people you're passionate about it and you're a beginner. When you get to be more intermediate, be honest about what your intermediate level skills are and so on. And part of the reward for that is that people will help you in a way that's suitable to your level. And hey, people are going to hate you anyway. In this day and age, I get hatred on the internet. I think all those other people, I think they all get plenty of hatred on the internet too. It's not that you can't win. It's that you can win, and you're also going to have a lot of unreasonable criticism. So, it's part of the game. And look, there are wonderful things about that side of the game too. As I just mentioned, I started off with that list of people I wanted to meet. If email didn't exist, it would have been very hard for me to meet any of those people, or I would have just met them once in person when they happened to be in Cambodia, when they happened to be in Laos, these other places I was living. And then I would have never crossed paths with them again, because email allowed you to maintain those contacts. And sometimes you meet people who introduce you to other people. But okay, look, that's the positive, wonderful side of studying Pali. If you do the hard work, if you're not a fraud, if you're honest with yourself and you're honest with other people, if you're a sincere scholar, even as a totally self-made scholar, and you're smart, you're not crazy, you're not trying to start a cult, all kinds of institutions will open those doors for you. And the institutions that don't open doors for you, the people who try to avoid you, try to have sympathy for them. A lot of the time they have something to hide. It's not only my experience. I've talked to other people who were reasonably advanced in Pali, where they talked to me about their experience. They went to see a Buddhist monk, as soon as it became clear that this person, the visitor, knew more Pali than the Buddhist monk, suddenly the whole mood changes and doors get closed and nobody wants to put up with you. I can, even in an academic setting, several times I went and met with professors, and then as soon as it became clear kind of what I had accomplished and what level I was at, which can come out in funny ways when you're talking to a professor, then they didn't want to be in the same room with me anymore. And I remember one university, all of the professors, they had a big department of Buddhist studies. All of the professors who were really confident in their area of expertise, so the specialists on ancient Chinese literature, Chinese Buddhism, Japanese Buddhism, Korean Buddhism, whatever the field was, the ones who were really confident in their languages and so on, met with me, and they had looked at my work and my CV and were happy to talk to me. They offered to publish my work. They offered to take me on as a graduate student. They kind of rolled out the red carpet. It was wonderful. But the one professor at that same university who never met with me and who never responded to any emails from me was the one professor who was supposed to be specialized in Pali. And I sympathize to some extent, but probably that guy didn't want to talk to me because he looked at the materials I'd sent and he probably felt afraid that I was a challenge to his authority. That, or he may also have had, supernatural beliefs that made him uncomfortable meeting me. That's also part of the game. Okay. Part 2. I said there were 3 parts to this discussion. I'm glad I did part 1, though, because most of the material you'll read from me on the internet is very negative, is warning you about how hard this road is to walk, how little there is waiting for you when you get to the end of the road, and the problems you're going to encounter along the way. Part 2, learning the language. Look, I had no teacher for this language. I met Bhikkhu Bodhi. I spent time with all kinds of Buddhist monks. Nobody helped me with learning the language. Nobody even gave me advice, except for, say, I guess, negative advice, telling me, oh, this institution is a scam, this one's bad, that kind of steering down the road. The number one mistake I made, my number one regret, was that when I started working on the language, I was working on poetry. My line of reasoning for this, it was partly based on what I'd read about Sanskrit, about methods of teaching yourself Sanskrit, and the historical tradition of how people transmitted and practiced these languages within India, ancient India, of course. I thought the best way for me to be able to study Pali sort of 24/7 would be to memorize short passages of poetry, to pick up that vocabulary, and then to be able to go over those poems with a fine-tooth comb, take apart the grammar, and so on. So that's not a totally stupid idea. It's not a terrible idea. But I regret it. In my first year of studying Pali, I wasted so much time and effort because I was working on the poetry. What you really want to work on within Pali when you're getting started, ideally, is a chrestomathy, a selection of passages, a very plainly written narrative. I can remember, so I'd been working on poetry for some time, and then I opened Pali Canon, was reading a particular passage that interested me for whatever philosophical reason. And it was just this incredibly simple sentence where it said something like, and then the Buddha came down the mountain and walked along the road that led to the river, and there was a small army town there, And, reading that, it's kind of ridiculous to say, but I felt like I was reading English. In contrast to the way the language was used in the poetry, the expression was so simple and so clear, and so lucid. And, this was such a contrast. When you are first learning the language, that is the type of material from within the Pali Canon you want to be reading. Naturally, if your interest is in the philosophy, you may want to immediately start with reading dense philosophical passages. You can't do that with any language. You can't do that with French or Dutch or German or, if you're learning Italian, you can't start with dense philosophical passages or dogmatic religious statements. What you really need to work on is that boring, practical narrative use of the language, which is almost all going to be third person, past tense. He walked down the road. I've done a lot of work. The reason why most people, a large percentage of people who know me on the internet know me because I made textbooks available as PDFs. I worked very hard to make educational materials available so other people could study Pali. You can get that, if you don't already know, if you Google my name, you can get it various ways. Within Google Books, I digitized some of them so that within the Google Books framework, it'll be permanently available. You can download the PDFs. And through different websites that I don't update anymore, you can also download those. And some people have used them for years. The textbooks I made, I'm aware because I speak to Buddhist monks and I get emails from Buddhist monks and I've seen it mentioned in print in various places. The resources I made to help people learn Pali have been used by Buddhist monks in Nepal, in Hong Kong, in Myanmar, in Taiwan, around the world. And of course, I assume they're predominantly used by people who speak English because they're in English. I've had some indication that somebody in Russia is using my work, which is great. They never talk to me, whoever the Russians are. Obviously, some of those languages, there's not that much available for people who are serious about learning Pali. But the lowest level of sort of pedestrian communication of the language, in some ways the most boring use of the language, is what you really need to work on when you're first starting. And you're not going to find that prepared for you. You're going to have a copy of the Pali Canon and prepare, in effect, prepare your own selections. Find passages that you can read and study that use the language in that kind of direct narrative way. Not philosophy, not poetry, other types of stuff. One of the other things I'm known for is the emphasis that all my materials give to orthography, to the writing systems. You need to be able to read Pali comparatively in more than one edition. So right off the bat, develop the ability to read Pali in Burmese script, in Cambodian script, in Sinhalese script, the script of Sri Lanka. Develop the ability to have open in front of you more than one paper book with more than one version of the Pali Canon, of whatever Pali text you have in your reading, so that you can do comparative reading between them. What does that win you? What do you get for that? First and foremost, I remember talking about this with Richard Gombrich. I talked about this with a list of professors. I mean, some of the professors, I remember talking to one professor who I won't name, and the questions he was asking me, even though he himself had a PhD and was, in theory, teaching Pali at a graduate level, a lot of the questions he asked me, I would have taught in a 101 course, in a Pali 101 course. They were really basic subjects, basic questions of where the books come from and which books to use, basic questions you need to know to do any research or just to study the language yourself. And I appreciated his honesty that he would ask me those questions, and I was happy to answer them for him. But this is one of the other problems with learning Pali, is that most university programs will just waste a lot of your time. They may give you an irrelevant education in Hinduism, in Sanskrit. If you're in a program of religious studies, you may spend a lot of your time debating Max Weber and the history of Protestantism and theoretical ideas about the study of religion in academia. It's not a complete waste of time, but it is an obstruction to you actually doing the work of becoming a Pali scholar. And this is one of the reasons why many people who have PhDs related to Pali, they don't have any of the practical knowledge or skills or experience that I managed to get in just my first few years. They haven't been out living in the jungle, the jungle in quotation marks. I spent some time literally in the jungle when I was in northwestern Laos. But they haven't been out in, Southeast Asia or Sri Lanka doing hands-on work. They haven't been nor in their own apartments are they sitting alone with the books open, hitting the language heavily. They're generally spending their time coping with harassment within a Western academic program, spending a lot of the time and energy managing the mood swings of their supervisor and the other grad students, and attending lectures that, again, lectures that may be related to Asian studies or religious studies, or may address theoretical questions that are currently fashionable. You may have a lot of talk about Foucault or whatever the current trendy philosopher theoretician is, but they're not doing the work. And they're also not really going to be receiving instruction in the language, in the real praxis of reading and writing and studying the language. So whether you're in an academic situation or not, even whether you're in a Buddhist monastery or not, because some people watching this may be Buddhist monks in monasteries thinking, yeah, I want to do better than this Canadian guy. 99% of the work is going to be you alone as an autodidact. I met face-to-face some of the last Buddhist monks to really be products of the old education system in Pali. That's partly because I did all this research on the Kachayana Vyakarana, on the history of pedagogy for the language. This raises a number of interesting subjects that may be useful for people to hear about. I met one Buddhist monk. He was an older guy. I guess he was 55 or 60 when I met him. When he was about 8 years old, he studied with the last traditional master of the Pali language in Sri Lanka, who was then a monk of more than 90 years old. So that guy I met, he was one of the last links to the old ways from the old days for how Buddhist monks used to learn Pali. It's gone. When you meet Buddhist monks or Asian people, Asian lay people who grew up in a Buddhist society, if they have mastered the Pali language and they're under 90 years of age, I guarantee you they learned Pali pretty much the same way I did. And the textbooks they use, even if they're not directly using Western textbooks, you'll be surprised to find if you look into the educational materials, which I did extensively. I mean, like for more than 10 years, I was looking at what are the textbooks used to teach Buddhist monks in Thailand, in Sri Lanka, in Laos, in Cambodia, in Western academia, everywhere. I was looking at textbooks, pedagogy. Wasn't interested in theoretical grammar. I was interested in the actual grammar, how it's learned and taught and used, how language acquisition, how the language is tested, how exams are conducted, all those questions. Everyone you meet today who either really is a Pali scholar or who claims to be will have learned in the Western-influenced style. Now, if you look at my published work, so far I have only said bad things about this, I think, because I was mostly talking about colonialism. And, European colonialism in Southeast Asia was ugly and brutal and killed people and burned down Buddhist temples and looted Buddhist temples of their works of art and piled up Buddhist manuscripts and lit them on fire. That brutality is real. What I've never talked about, just because my career as a Pali scholar didn't last long enough, there are also positive elements to that very sad history. I found a lot of obscure publications produced in Myanmar during the sort of the first explosion of scholarly excitement when Western technologies and Buddhist traditions came into contact with one another. When under the British Empire in Myanmar, in Burma, you had for the first time Pali schools being set up. There was just one in Rangoon, where they used a European-style system of examinations, of textbooks, of tests, and of language exercises that was directly imitating the way ancient Greek was taught in Europe, to some extent how Latin was taught in Europe. And of course, Europeans also brought the technology of modern book making, book binding. So instead of palm leaf manuscripts having ink on paper for the first time, although my printed work so far focuses almost totally on the devastating, sad, terrible, evil aspects of European colonialism, the positive side was that a lot of local people said, wow, this is my opportunity to publish that book I was always wanting to publish, maybe their first contact with the technology of book publishing. And those impulses did not just come from the center. I mean, so for example, in Myanmar, if you look up the name James Gray, James Gray was producing some of the first Pali textbooks that were a European style textbook, fill in the blank exercises, these kinds of things, modeled on ancient Greek and Latin, and Pali exams, coming in and writing an exam the way we in the modern West would think of it, so people would prove they had learned the language. The arrival of these methods, people didn't respond to this as oppression, because at that time the traditional system was still vibrant. Many people said, wow, this is great, this is an opportunity, this is a new way to learn, or a new way to prove what you've learned. Traditional methods rely much more on authoritarian relationships between a senior monk and a younger monk, memorization. I won't get into it. If I digress into that, this video will be even longer. But the arrival of those European scholars, those European technologies of scholarship, technologies of education, methods of pedagogy, the positive aspect was that in the short term touched off a revival of scholarly interest in Pali within countries like Myanmar and Sri Lanka. Now, the bad news is this was part of a colonial regime that devastated Buddhism and devastated local political autonomy, devastated the local society, that led to the collapse of many things in the culture and many bad things to be said about it. Cambodia is sort of an interesting exception to the rule that confirms the rule. The history of the Institut Bouddhique, the French Buddhist Institute in Cambodia, has actually been written about relatively extensively in French, but also in English. And I think they did that mostly out of envy for looking at what the Royal Asiatic Society was doing in Sri Lanka and elsewhere. And I said, well, we have to put a respectable face on the fact that French dominion now controls places like Cambodia and Laos. And, anyway, I got to see the last gasp of that tradition when I was living in Cambodia and Laos. Among the people who opened the doors for me and treated me so well, the people who controlled the École Française Extrême-Orient, that's literally the French school of studies in the Far East, in the Extreme Orient. In Vientiane and Laos, they were wonderful to me. They opened the door for me. They, gave me access to all kinds of scholarly resources in their archives and so on. And by contrast, the people in the same institution in Cambodia treated me like garbage. But hey, it is what it is. Some of those guys talked to me by email, the guys in Phnom Penh. But no, in general, they were not interested in talking to me in Phnom Penh. And that, of course, reflected the fact that the particular people, were they open to Pali scholarship as opposed to Sanskrit, as opposed to being interested in archaeology, art history, and other subjects. But I got to see the end of that tradition when I was in former French colonies in Southeast Asia. The work of learning Pali is in some ways the same as any other language, and in some ways it's uniquely difficult and uniquely awful. You have to have incredible motivation, incredible stamina, and incredible focus. I mean, look, during more than 10 years I was involved in Pali, you have no idea how many people got in touch with me by email saying, yeah, I'm into this. I'm 100% committed to this. I'm going to learn this language. I'm going to become a scholar in this field. And then at some point, 2 years later, 5 years later, what have you, they're gone. They drop out. And of course, I can sympathize with why. Enormous sacrifice of your time. And as I've said to many people, if you compare it to learning how to play the guitar, learning how to play the guitar is a lot easier. The rewards socially and even economically are much greater. And, people aren't going to hate you for it. People will love you for being a legit Pali scholar, but people will also hate you because you're a threat to religious authority. You're a threat to certain political assumptions. Sometimes you're a threat to national pride. There was a guy in Thailand, and I don't want to shout out his name, but I remember so he was based in Bangkok, and he had connections to the universities there, but only informal connections. He wasn't a professor. He was just present as a self-made scholar in Bangkok. And when I was out in the remote northwest of Thailand, where I was speaking Lao, not Thai, I remember I spoke to a woman who didn't seem to have any formal education, but she cared about Buddhism. And she said to me passionately, she said, there's this one foreigner in Bangkok, and he's a real scholar of Buddhism, which is true. Good, reasonable compliment to give the guy. He's a real scholar of Buddhism. And whenever he goes to academic conferences in Bangkok, all the Thai scholars have to hang their heads in shame and be silent because that guy, that foreigner, he's a white man, he's a Westerner, he really knows his stuff, and the professors of the Thai universities, they're all corrupt, they don't know what they're doing. That might be a slight exaggeration, but there was a lot of truth to it. And what shocked me was I was standing on the banks of the Mekong River. I was in the middle of nowhere. And I was talking to somebody who was not a career academic, somebody who I believe had no university diploma at all. And she knew this. She was in the loop for this gossip, whatever you want to say. So that reflects just existing as somebody who can offer a dissenting opinion about history, about the language, about the religion. That's a threat that is really felt at the core of these very conservative, very hierarchical institutions. In Thailand, as an example, and many people will say to you, well, Thailand, it's a relatively easygoing, open-minded culture compared to Taiwan, compared to Japan. I mean, you want to talk about orthodoxy. I can tell stories about Japan. I mean, having academic conferences where nobody's allowed to ask any questions, getting peer review back that says you dared to criticize this other publication, therefore we're not going to publish this. You're dealing with, in some ways, the most conservative, most hierarchical aspect of these different cultures. And Sri Lanka, tempers get really hot in Sri Lanka. In some ways, it's better than the kind of silence imposed on Buddhist studies in the rest of Asia. But in Sri Lanka, people will scream at you, and I think people get into fistfights with you often enough too. I say this, and look, my research is not controversial. It shouldn't be by any reasonable standards. If I would have been working on ancient Greek or Latin, nothing I have to say would be considered controversial. During the years that I was a Pali scholar, I openly identified as Buddhist. I was fundamentally pro-Buddhist. And, that doesn't mean I was uncritical of Buddhism. I'm not pro-slavery. I'm not in favor of men and women having unequal rights. I support men and women having equal rights. I support democracy. I don't support ancient kingdoms. None of that I felt disqualified me as a Buddhist, as someone who could make a positive contribution to the scholarship and the religion. I considered myself an advocate for the religion. I consider myself somebody who not only was willing to discuss Buddhist philosophy and history as interesting, but really, during those years when I was a Pali scholar, I felt I was somebody who could positively preach some of that stuff, propound it in a non-objective way. All is impermanent. Life is suffering. There is no soul, To me, those things they're still worth talking about, they're still worth preaching, and so on. And in terms of, the cultural aspect of it, all these countries have cultural problems and political problems. Believe me. Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, they got problems. I'm not interested in rose-colored glasses. I'm not interested in glorifying them uncritically. But compare them to Indonesia. Compare them to Bangladesh. Compare them to communist China. I also have a lot to say in favor of Theravada Buddhist countries, politically, socially, culturally, and so on. In many ways, I was well suited to be a kind of positive, uplifting advocate for this stuff. I wasn't in a position of hostility to this field of studies. This brings us to point 3. Why did I quit? If I put in all this time if I gained reading comprehension of the language, if I put in all the hours to, as I mentioned, I had very good handwriting, the ability to not only read, but write in the Burmese tradition of Pali, the Thai, the Cambodian, blah, 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 blah. Put in all this time and effort, why would I quit? Well, I remember I got on the phone with somebody. He was a PhD candidate at the time. I don't know if he's now finished his PhD. And he talked to me about altruism in my study. He said to me, well, your work must be motivated by altruism. And I said, no. And that shocked him. I said, look, when I was working with a charity on the border between Laos and Myanmar, and that charity's raison d'etre was to hand out sacks of rice to starving people, that's altruism. Let's not mess around, okay? Altruism exists in this world. On the border between Thailand and Laos, there is an orphanage to help babies, children born with HIV/AIDS who have been abandoned by their own parents. It's run by Christians, not by Buddhists. It's controlled by Christian missionaries. That's altruism. I used to talk to Buddhists about it, say, look, how can you leave this for Christian missionaries? Come on. These are your orphans. This is your, you've got to organize a Buddhist alternative. No. Leave it for the Christians. Bad karma. If those babies were born with a disability, we don't want to know because that's bad karma. Stuff you deal with. If you really are out there in the field, this is what you deal with in Buddhism today. That's altruism. Those two charities I mentioned as an example are altruism. What am I looking for me as a scholar, for me as an independent intellectual, for someone who is definitely not making money out of Pali, out of Theravada Buddhism, out of this language, out of these histories, cultures, peoples? It's still not altruism. Okay? If you put in this time and this work, what you want back is an intellectual reward, not a financial reward. But that intellectual reward is still tremendously important. And your motives, if you're honest with yourself, are not altruistic. If you take the time to write an academic book review, easy to do. You don't need a PhD to do that. If you're still a student, you can start writing book reviews now. What's motivating you? It shouldn't be an animus toward the author of the original book. It shouldn't be to try to score points by showing you're smarter than the book you're reviewing. It shouldn't be anything like that. If you're going to review a book that's out there, it's because you want to be part of an intellectual tradition, a discourse, a dialogue. You want to be involved in discussing those issues. Right? And who do you want to discuss them with? You want to discuss them with other people whose opinions you respect. If you put in the hard work to really learn Pali, to become a Pali scholar, etc., and let's say you go to that same conference I described earlier where I met Richard Gombrich for the first time. Why are you going there? It's not altruism. You're going there. You're not going there to make money either. You're not going there on an ego trip. But you're going because you hope to be part of an intellectual tradition of some kind, a brand new intellectual tradition. It doesn't have to be an intellectual tradition that stretches back to more than 2,500 years ago in ancient India. It can be a brand new intellectual tradition. But you want to be discussing these issues with other people who care about them, with other people who know about them, with other people whose opinion you respect. So that's not altruism. And what I've just said, I think if people are really honest with themselves in many different areas of intellectual endeavor, they would agree. They would say the same thing. If you ask someone who is a Marxist, what motivates you to do all this hard work about Marxism, I'm sure many of them would say it's because they want to be part of this intellectual tradition. They want to engage with other people they respect and so on. After so many years of being involved with Pali, with Theravada Buddhism, after doing everything I wanted to do, and many things I never dreamed I would do. I never dreamed I would have the experience of waking up on the Mekong River. I never dreamed that the Mekong River would go from being this, tremendously distant, exotic place to being a mode of transport for me, taking these small wooden boats up and down the Mekong River. I never thought I'd meet Bhikkhu Bodhi in his current location in the United States. I never thought I would sleep under the same roof where Bhikkhu Bodhi used to live, where he became famous, the Forest Hermitage in Sri Lanka. I never thought I'd see any of that stuff. I never thought I'd do that stuff. I never thought I'd meet those people. I never thought I'd be able to see the kind of ancient artifacts. Wonderful. I'd done it all. But what was missing is exactly this question of an intellectual tradition, of having colleagues you respect. And again, so I've mentioned within Western academia, there were all kinds of people who appreciated my work and were positive and encouraged me. Because I mentioned Stanford by name, I'll use that as the example. Stanford, they said, yeah, okay, you can come here, you can get a PhD, and they, there are details, obviously, about how the application goes. Blah, 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 all these details. But the reality was, if I had gone to Stanford, all of my colleagues would have been Tibetan specialists. Tibetan Buddhism, Tibetan language, Tibetan history. That's not my tradition. I don't want to be a part of that. I don't want to talk about that. I don't hate Tibet, but look at a map. Tibet and Thailand are remarkably far apart. And there may be some wonderful scholars of Tibetan Buddhism, Tibetan history, Tibetan politics at Stanford or at other universities. I don't want anything to do with that. So I've got to be honest with myself with that. After a number of years, not just being in the game, but, seeing so much directly, hands-on, visiting so many universities in person, not just reading about them on the internet. And, in terms of reading, I wasn't just reading ancient manuscripts, reading all the new academic literature that comes out. There aren't that many decent journals, believe me. There's not that much to read, sadly. But I started at University of Toronto, which still had an excellent library built up by A.K. Warder. And I met A.K. Warder. These guys left behind their books. After getting this incredibly thorough survey, I had to admit to myself, there is no tradition today for me to be a part of. And I can't create a tradition out of nothing. And I can't do this totally alone. I'm a Canadian citizen. Come back to Canada. Is there any way I can study Pali in Canada? Is there any way I can study modern Burmese in Canada? Is there any way I'd be able to work on... Long story short, no. I could have ended on a positive note. Instead, the positivity is at the beginning of this video. So if you want to cheer yourself up, hit play again, go back to the start, and hear how wonderful my life was as a Pali scholar. Because there were a lot of wonderful things about it. With nothing but a backpack and a bicycle and a lot of hard work, I went everywhere. I did everything. I lived my dream. When that dream was over, I had to look at the reality of the tradition as it exists today and say, I can't be a part of it. Is that a happy ending or a sad ending? Can't it be both?